Hi, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to speak today. I am speaking to you live from Hong Kong. It's about 10 p.m. here. Thank you all for getting up this morning to hear this talk. And so I have advised Professor Alford, who's very kind enough to extend me this invitation, that I'm not actually an expert in the area of privacy. As the very generous introduction mentioned, I'm a scholar in the area of comparative constitutional law and also law and political science, but I'll try to speak a bit from firsthand experience and maybe from a legal perspective as to what's been happening in Hong Kong. There's obviously a lot in the news. I think people are probably aware that the Hong Kong government, well, actually I should say the government in Beijing has imposed on Hong Kong a national security law. And that has been accompanied by a political crackdown, all of which has been in response to protests that started in the middle of 2019 over an extradition law. So the national security law is broad enough that probably at several points in this talk, I will say things that could arguably be violations of law. I just thought I would throw that out there, but I'm going to do it anyway. So here we go. What is life like these days in Hong Kong as a regular person living here, as an academic? I've been here since 2016 when I first came here on a leave of absence from Washington University in St. Louis. A number of things have changed. One thing that hasn't changed is email, quote unquote, security or the lack thereof. My first day on the job, I was advised by colleagues not to use our work exchange email for anything even vaguely sensitive. Let me now share this slide with you. Let's see here. Share screen, here we go. This should be it. So yes. Okay, and so I'll be using this here. Is that visible to everyone, hopefully? Yes? Okay. So email security, I was warned my first day on the job that whatever not to say anything even remotely sensitive because it will be, we were warned by IT that there's no, that the email's compromised, and it's fairly obvious who compromised it. So one thing I had to adjust to immediately was simply assuming that all communication that I do is not secure. All right. So the second thing that one had to get used to here is, and this was before the national security law was adopted, surveillance by the China Liaison Office. There were reports in the media, which are no doubt correct, that the China Liaison Office, which is kind of like an embassy, but not quite, it's the body in Hong Kong that is responsible for relations between Hong Kong and the mainland, and it has its own security officials, had placed some academic units under surveillance. And three in particular were named. One is the Political Science Department at Chinese University of Hong Kong. The second, the Journalism School at Hong Kong Baptist University. And the third, the institution of which I'm a proud faculty member, the University of Hong Kong HKU Law Faculty. So surveillance is kind of a fact of life there. And supposedly there are observers sent by the liaison office to see what's happening in these classes. I view that as an opportunity to try to educate people, but it may be unnerving for some. I think the key to dealing with that kind of surveillance is really to change nothing. There's nothing that I would normally say that I would not want the largest possible size audience to hear. You know, we as academics don't really thrive on secrecy. We like to disseminate our message as widely as possible. So I don't think there's anything really to be done in response to having a Chinese agent other than possibly feeling sorry that they have to sit through 30 hours of comparative constitutional law. The COVID crisis has brought with it some new twists. There are a number of countries, jurisdictions, Hong Kong, one of them, that have apps. They are trying to encourage people to download. In the case of Singapore, they're more or less requiring it, I think. In Hong Kong, if you want to eat in a restaurant, for example, or visit a gym, you are supposed to download this app, or you're allowed to manually sign in. Older Hong Kong people are voluntarily signing up for this app, but younger people are not. The government promises, the idea is that the government, when you scan this app, can keep track of who has been in close contact with someone who's had COVID. Supposedly the data is disposed of after 30 days. I don't know many people who actually believe that. And of course, the fear that people have is if you come into close contact with someone who's had COVID in Hong Kong, you are sent to mandatory government quarantine in a special camp they have for that, which is not very appealing for a lot of people. So not a lot of incentives to cooperate with the measure. Both people have data privacy security concerns. They feel the government's going to abuse their information. The government has been less than forthright for the last 2 years about pretty much everything you can think of. And so the confidence is simply not there when public health measures really need people's cooperation. It's simply not there. Something else that's happened on an everyday basis. Hong Kong kind of runs on this WhatsApp application. Some of you may have seen it. It's now owned by Facebook. Pretty much any business you deal with, whether it's booking a dental appointment or physical therapy, or buying toys for your kid, pretty much everything booking a hair appointment, everything can be done through WhatsApp. Every business in Hong Kong, instead of calling them, you can WhatsApp them. And although some people say this is a response to changes in their terms of service, really the switch from WhatsApp to Signal started to occur long before that happened, because people were concerned that the end-to-end encryption and security were inadequate compared to options like Signal. For similar reasons, people have migrated off Facebook. Some have moved to this new platform called MeWe. But there are still a lot of Hong Kong people who are on Facebook, but a lot of people have canceled their accounts. And as I'll get to later, I get a lot of requests from people who say are more vulnerable. They don't have tenure, they don't have foreign passports. They kind of lurk on Facebook. They kind of want to see what's going on and they want the message to get out. So people send me things and ask me to post them, and I try to oblige. SIM cards, this is something that maybe Americans take for granted. But for the longest time, here in Hong Kong, like in a lot of places, you could basically go into a 7-Eleven and buy a SIM card and use a cell phone. So the government wants to move away from that and do sort of more what the United Arab Emirates does, which is to tie every SIM card purchase to real identification and a government database. And once you can tie people to their cell phones, their IMEI information, you can begin to re-identify supposedly de-identified data. You can track them through location data, so on and so forth, right? So no more anonymous cell phone usage. A couple of things I want to go into in slightly greater depth. The idea that Hong Kong protesters have attacked lampposts. Some of you may be wondering how exactly could that be the case and why would they do that? And along the way, I'll mention something called Project Dove. And then I'll talk about the mass arrest of protesters in Hong Kong and how that ties into surveillance and how and why surveillance is part of any authoritarian regime's playbook for holding on to power. Okay, so protesters versus lampposts. So the Hong Kong government had the idea of installing about 400, still does, the plan of installing about 400 of these smart lampposts over the course of 3 years. Some of its features include a Bluetooth beacon which is justified on the grounds of detecting vehicle speed. They are LiDAR equipped, which is a laser form of radar, which is supposedly to measure traffic and people flow. They have license plate recognition technology, video monitoring, which the government says is to catch people dumping industrial waste without permission. This was done by a local firm called Tic Tac, which pulled out of the project after its executives and employees were threatened, and protesters tore down around 20 of these things in mid-2019. The government's response was that the smart lampposts pose no threat to personal privacy, and it denounced protesters for attacking Hong Kong small business and debilitating Hong Kong's innovation and technology sectors. Now, that may sound like a paranoid response on the part of protesters. Certainly the pro-Beijing media depicted that way, but kind of to put that in perspective, the kinds of things the Chinese government's been working on, this is something from mid-2018, actually, it became public, or was widely reported, Project Dove. These are bird surveillance devices, bird-like surveillance devices that are so realistic that they fool real birds into flying alongside them. They're basically silent, they mimic the movements of birds, they have high-resolution cameras, GPS tracking abilities, et cetera, and they've been deployed. It's been publicly reported they've been deployed by 30+ Chinese military and government agencies in at least 5 provinces, including Xinjiang. So it's hard to say whether the smart lampposts were in fact a little too smart for their own good, but given this sort of technology, it's perhaps understandable that protesters were not entirely, don't entirely have confidence in the Hong Kong government's plans. I want to say a bit about the kinds of the level of arrests that are occurring, who's being arrested, and why, and what the arrests have to do with surveillance. One of the people recently arrested is a US citizen, a 79-year-old lawyer and former priest named John Clancy. It is implausible that Clancy has knowingly violated any law of any kind. The question is, why then do they want to arrest him? The most likely reason is that he is the former treasurer of a pro-democracy organization, and why would they then want to go after him? So the Hong Kong government is taking the approach toward the pro-democracy movement as a US attorney would take toward busting the mob through a RICO investigation. The idea here is that they want to seize as much data as they can, and most likely so they can find evidence of foreign involvement, foreign financial involvement in any way, shape, or form, which will allow them to tell a particular narrative. All right, so what is the narrative that this kind of surveillance feeds? Search and surveillance pursuant to arrest is part of an overall authoritarian strategy for the Chinese government. So a small part of this strategy has the following prongs. First, you obviously, given that you don't have elections, but you need to justify the fact that you are in power and have given yourself a perpetual constitutional monopoly on power. Well, how do you justify the fact that you've put yourself in power permanently? Well, first you have to insist that everyone is in fact happy with the government and deny that anyone is unhappy with the government. So if everyone's happy, then why shouldn't you continue in power? Second, you have to suppress evidence that people are unhappy with the government. So some examples of that would be one of the first institutions they raided was Hong Kong's leading polling operation. I think their only government polling operation, HKPORI, the Hong Kong Public Opinion Research Institute, which actually used to be part of the University of Hong Kong and then was separated from the university a couple of years ago after a fair amount of controversy where the university pressured the polling institution to stop doing polls about the popularity of the chief executive. That led to the resignation of the university's chancellor, vice chancellor, I should say. So the problem with polling operations is they consistently reveal basement level popularity ratings for Hong Kong's unelected leadership. And that makes the government look bad, so they don't like polls. So you raid the polls, you look for evidence of crimes that can then be used to shut them down, or at least exercise a chilling effect over their operations by reminding them that you're watching them closely. Another form of evidence that people are unhappy with the government, even if it's elections, district council elections in Hong Kong for relatively meaningless, low-level positions that are concerned with the arrangement of bus stops, the fact that there's a pro-democracy vote is evidence that the silent majority is not in support of Beijing. And so the response to that is you either redesign the elections or you just cancel them altogether, which is what has happened with the upcoming legislative council elections. They were simply canceled on account of COVID. Another obvious tactic for authoritarian regimes is to silence people who criticize the government. So for example, Jimmy Lai, the tycoon publisher of Apple Daily, he is already in prison and was recently arrested again while still in prison after bail was denied for further offenses of subversion under the national security law. Of course, propaganda, long way of saying that, brute force repetition of nonsensical, baseless arguments through state-owned media and fellow travelers. And finally, something that dictators the world over, from Robert Mugabe to Xi Jinping, really love to do is to blame outsiders if there's any unhappiness. And so again, the surveillance is a way of getting information on people and trying to tie them together and to incriminate them as part of a larger conspiracy, especially one with foreign forces. So some statistics on arrest in Hong Kong. So those green sections are people who are, this is starting in mid-2019, people who are just released after arrest, people who are entered into legal proceedings, and then people who remain under investigation. So a very high number of people are being arrested, including that I would suspect well, I shouldn't speculate on individual cases, but a lot of people are being arrested and they can't even be charged with anything, right? The prosecutors, as zealous as they are, can't think of anything. And that's because the point really actually isn't to arrest them, it's to get them into the system. arresting people allows you to do a bunch of things. It allows you to seize their passports. It allows you to impose movement restrictions, curfew, require that they report in the police on a regular basis. And most of all, it allows you to search and seize data and go on fishing expeditions to try to link people together. To prolong the amount of time that the police have to engage in this kind of combined search and surveillance, police will give defense lawyers the runaround. They will claim that they don't know where a person is detained. They will give the wrong location for where the person is detained. They do this. They've been doing this systematically over the last 2 years. It used to be an occasional occurrence. Now it's a routine thing, during which time they do things like pressure detainees into unlocking their phones, which they're not legally required to do. And then also, of course, arrest, prosecute journalists for exposing police misconduct. Let me see if I'm able to bring this video up here. I want to give an example of how surveillance can be used for good, where surveillance is turned against the people usually doing the surveilling. And let me try to share the correct screen here. Here we go. So this is a pretty fantastic video that the New York Times pulled together. And this relates to an incident in the Yuanlong train station. I don't know if there's going to be audio on this. It looks like my speaking is incompatible with this thing. So I'll try to explain what's going on here. There was an attack by white-shirted triad mobs, a white-shirted triad mob on men, women, children at the end of the day at a train station. And the police were widely criticized for not responding. The New York Times did an incredible job of pulling together people's cell phone data, cell phone videos, surveillance camera footage, simply piecing together things on a timeline. And what they were able to show is that the Hong Kong police, contrary to what they said, knew that people were being attacked. The people who were being attacked were people who were suspected of having participated in protests. And the people doing the attacking were these white-shirted thugs with sticks and canes who were beating people bloody. Many of them had triad tattoos, and they were hired by pro-Beijing forces. There you just saw a pro-Beijing politician named Junius Ho encouraging and welcoming the thugs who were beating people. And what the New York Times did was putting together sort of this third-party surveillance information. They were able to show that the police, in fact, literally shut the gates on people who came out of Yuanlong Station seeking protection from this mob. Okay, so now what happened? What was the aftermath of that? I'll show you kind of what happened after that. Let's see, a lot of, okay. So the aftermath of that episode was a bunch of reporters got kicked out. The New York Times had most of its staff not just removed from the mainland, which I think would have been sort of eye-opening to begin with, but something that hasn't happened before. In the last year or two, we're seeing journalists being excluded from Hong Kong, which was always supposed to be an oasis of freedom of information. It's a place that Freedom House had always ranked very highly for freedom. The Cato Institute ranked Hong Kong even higher than the United States itself. And as you can see, the major US media outlets, most of their staff have been excluded or booted from not just the mainland, but from Hong Kong. And in that video, there's a politician named, a local elected official named Lam Chuk Ting, who is seen calling for the police to help as they're being beaten by the mob. The response is, and not only have no police been prosecuted, but Lam himself has been arrested again for disclosing information about the individuals being investigated in relation to the Yuanlong mob attacks. So these kinds of technologies can be a force for good, but it's definitely not a level playing field. So what does one do in this kind of situation? So there's no, I don't have a lot of personal experience with what to do if the place you're living in becomes authoritarian and there's a surveillance/political crackdown. So this is kind of making it up as we go along. My own inclination, and I don't judge colleagues, we've had a number of chats, we've had online faculty meetings where people ask things like, well, can I still include X on my syllabus? Can I still include Y on my syllabus? Can we even talk about the national security law itself without violating the national security law? We had a discussion about whether we should introduce guidelines for what can and cannot be discussed. For instance, talking about Taiwan and whether Taiwan is a sovereign state, or talking about whether genocide is occurring in Xinjiang. These things are all prohibited by the national security law, it would seem. And the conclusion was that we should not adopt guidelines for working around the national security law, and I was certainly opposed to guidelines. The reason being that they would operate as a one-way ratchet. If you comply with the guidelines, that's no guarantee that you won't be prosecuted, because the point of this, I think part of the point of this incredibly overreaching national security law, which applies to any speech that brings the Hong Kong or Chinese government into contempt, no matter where in the world it occurs, any call for sanctions against Hong Kong or Chinese officials, even if you're an elected official in Denmark, that's against Chinese law now. So the reach of it is pretty incredible. The problem is that following guidelines doesn't protect you. The government can still come after you. If you don't follow the guidelines, then you're really hosed, because the government can come after you, and they can also bludgeon you with the fact that you didn't even follow your own institution's guidelines. So we're all pretty much on our own in terms of what to do in response to the national security law. My response has been to lean in. So for example, in my comparative constitutional law syllabus, I have added a unit on secession and the right to resist. However, I've added to that the optional part of the syllabus where students can vote on whether for the second half of the course, they vote on which topics they'd like to cover, and that's one of the options they'll have to vote on. Obviously, it's not good to compel students into choosing that, but I will bet you anything that they will plumb for it overwhelmingly. While some people are backing away from social media, I'm trying to maintain a more active presence on Facebook. The first thing I did was to commit publicly never to compromise or to self-censor. And I made a point of being at least as critical of the Chinese regime as I always was. People who have taken their accounts down or don't want to post anymore will often send me things and I'll repost them, which may lead some people to think that I'm really a little overactive, but that's, what I'm trying to do is to be a channel for a lot of what's going on. And a lot of this is, the idea is to prevent a shifting of the Overton window, right? The Overton window is this concept that there is an acceptable, respectable set of views, and within this range, these are the plausible outcomes that reasonable people can believe on, because people have a tendency to want to be in the middle and to want to see themselves as moderate, and that can be manipulated. And so what we see is a censoring of the liberal position and increasing aggressiveness of the pro-Beijing position. So I think one thing that academics can try to do, given the relative security that we have, is to try to ensure that the full range of opinions continues to be expressed. On a day-to-day basis, but again, I don't judge people who don't do this, because I have tenure and I have a job waiting for me in the United States, and I have a foreign passport. So that can't be said for everyone in Hong Kong. So everyone has to kind of find their own way through this. I assume that everything I say is read and digested by the government, and I lean into that too by trying to formulate what I say in a way that will shame pro-Beijing judges who think of themselves as faithful servants of the rule of law. And I try to say things that will expose to them the hypocrisy of prosecuting, convicting anti-government critics. And then finally, again, I don't believe that I have any privacy in my communications, but I try to divert communications through US channels and US institutions, not because I think they're safe and secure, but because at least I can trigger US jurisdiction that way. I don't know what good that's going to do, but that's kind of my thinking behind it. So I think that's right about time. So I really welcome not only comments, but suggestions and thoughts on how people in Hong Kong can deal with the situation. One of the problems here is this is not, Hong Kong's not a country of 300 million strong like the United States, right? The US, when there are legal or political issues or problems to be digested, an incredibly capable, well-resourced and talented academic apparatus swings into gear. Here in Hong Kong, we have a total of 3 law schools, only one of which really has a significant investment in public law for a variety of reasons. And so we just don't have the human capital. We don't have, people, for example, we don't have an army of people who specialize in digital privacy issues. So there really is room and opportunity for people who write scholarship to reach out in a comparative direction. It's not that there isn't a lot of work to be done in the United States. Alarmingly, there is a lot of work to be done in the US on these issues. But one can really make a difference by focusing one's attention in other jurisdictions. I say this aware that asking for foreign help is potentially a violation of national security law, but I think this is genuinely an area where there are returns to be had for scholars who are enterprising and willing to be comparative. That's my own bias. Comparative law has served me well, and I hope it'll serve many of you well too. Obviously, speaking to the GICL crowd, I think that message has already been well taken. But let's do what we can to spread the word. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
David, can I ask you a question? This is Roger Alford.
Yes, Roger.
Thank you so much. That was really fantastic. I really appreciate it. I've been to Hong Kong. I've never lived there, but I've been to Hong Kong many times. And my impression has always been that the judges there are just incredibly competent and respected and take the rule of law seriously. It was one of the great exports of the United Kingdom, I guess you could say, is the rule of law in Hong Kong. Can you speak about the judiciary and how they're addressing the national security law and these issues?
Yeah. So a couple of things are happening. First, it used to be that there was a hypersensitivity on the part of the bar, the government, everyone to any criticism of judges, right? You couldn't criticize judges. That was, well, you're compromising judicial independence. And now what happens is if pro-Beijing judges are criticized, the bar still leaps to the defense and so does the government. But if a judge, for example, grants bail to protesters or grants bail to Jimmy Lai, the pro-Beijing media piles on, and the silence of the Secretary of Justice, the silence of the government is deafening. 2 years ago, it would have been an absolute no-brainer that the Secretary of Justice, maybe the chief executive herself, would have jumped right in and defended the independence and integrity of the judiciary. Now they only speak when someone is accused of being too pro-government. So we're already seeing kind of an obvious one-sidedness on the part of the government. Inside the judiciary, and I'm going here on, I can't obviously attribute what I'm saying now. A lot of the dirty work is being done by judges who are approved for national security law cases. And that is more or less a decision of the chief executive in collaboration with some of her close advisors. And the feeling, what I'm told is the feeling within the judiciary is, number one, happy not to have that hot potato, right? Because if you get handed these sensitive cases, you've still got to decide them to the best of your ability and in precisely the manner you described. And these judges are simply being cut out of that. And they're not fighting it publicly. And what I'm hearing is that some of them are perfectly happy to not be put in the hot seat in that way. So you're getting a combination of selection and self-selection of the most pro-Beijing judges, which also allows the government to say that, we're not cracking down on judges, no one's terms of employment are being wrecked. There was recently a judge who was criticized for acquitting a protester because he concluded that the police officer's evidence was fabricated and was not to be believed. And he was, so he was removed from hearing cases, but promoted in pay grade to a higher paying but non-adjudicative administrative position. So, what's that, right? It's technically a promotion. Yeah. So I think there's a certain amount of threading the needle that's going on in terms of the treatment of the judiciary. I can also say that, and stop me if, there's a number of questions that are started to pile up. I should be looking at the Google Docs document for this. The succession of the current Chief Justice is not viewed as having been politicized. The person who's coming in now, Andrew Chung, was considered the leading candidate anyway to be Chief Justice. But what we don't have is, people say, is the kind of leadership that we had under Hong Kong's first Chief Justice, Andrew Lee, who was sort of a, like a John Marshall type. That's not the right analogy, but he thought very carefully and closely about the institutional capital and reputation of the judiciary, both domestically and internationally. And we have now people who are institutional players, let's put it that way. They're not maybe strategic players in terms of what the interests and needs of the institution are. They're kind of maybe judges, so to speak. Perhaps they're very genial, perhaps they're very professional, they don't do the wrong things, they're very by the book. And so, what happens when you put judges who are very by the book in a British sense in an increasingly authoritarian environment? I would say that they're very maladapted. And we don't do a lot of self-examination of the way that judges think about their jobs here. Look, they inherited this, not just judicial restraintist mentality, but the British version of a judicial restraintist mentality, right? Where Parliament is sovereign, it's the repository of the popular will, and the British don't even really, the idea of judicial review is still a little awkward for them. And so that kind of judicial restraint makes sense when you are the courts and you're dealing with an elected government. But the thing about Hong Kong, which Hong Kong judges have not internalized, is this government is not elected, right? So judges aren't any less legitimate than government officials. If anything, they're more legitimate from a democratic perspective because they're more accessible and they're more transparent. And so we have judges acting as if, well, that's not the role of a judge. But the reason that's not the role of a judge is because they learned the role of a judge from judges in a democracy. But Hong Kong's not a democracy. So the normative justification for deference and restraintism it's just not there. But that's not how the judges think. They're still thinking in terms of these British habits, which don't apply. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I don't know if there are more questions in the Google Doc here. Yes, I can answer one question. So anyway, I think we may be at time. I think that's what the notice I'm seeing means. So I'm going to, thank you for the opportunity to comment on this, and I'll turn it back over to whoever's moderating.